Get the help to move these bags before the Hendersons see them sitting on the veranda like that. That was my mother-in-law's voice, carrying across the pool deck of the Windmere Cove Resort, loud enough for 3 families and a bartender named Miguel to hear. She wasn't talking about a bellhop. She was talking about me. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I certainly had to. 22 years of marriage, and in front of my husband, my children, and 40 strangers in linen shorts, Eleanor Whitfield pointed at 4 suitcases and called me the help. 4 hours later, I was sitting in a rented Lincoln in the resort parking lot with my attorney on speakerphone, listening to him say the words that would end that family's version of reality forever. "Rachel," he said, "the paperwork is ready. Whenever you're ready to walk back in there, I'll be right behind you. I want to tell you how a woman gets from being called the help at 9 in the morning to holding the deed to the very resort her husband's family had vacationed at for 3 generations by 4 in the afternoon. It's not a story about luck. It's not a story about an inheritance that fell into my lap, or a lottery ticket, or a rich uncle nobody knew about. It's a story about 20 years of building something in the dark, brick by brick, while the people who should have valued me most decided I wasn't worth looking at twice. My name is Rachel Bennett Whitfield, and this is the story of the summer I stopped being invisible. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you the most, stay with me for this one, because I think you'll recognize a little bit of yourself in it. And if you do, I'd love it if you subscribed. This channel is full of stories just like this one, about the quiet kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I met Daniel Whitfield when I was 26 years old, waiting tables at a steakhouse in Tampa to put myself through night classes at the University of South Florida. He was 31, the youngest son of a family that had made its money 3 generations back in citrus groves, and then quietly moved that money into real estate holdings up and down the Gulf Coast. Daniel wasn't like the rest of them, or at least he wasn't yet. He tipped well, he asked about my classes, and on our 3rd date he told me he didn't care that I grew up in a double-wide outside of Plant City with a single mother who cleaned houses for a living. "I like people who built something," he told me. "My family just inherited theirs." I believed him. For a long time, I had every reason to. We got married 18 months later at a small chapel his mother sniffed at for being quaint, which I would later understand was Eleanor Whitfield's word for anything that cost less than 6 figures. I finished my degree in business administration while pregnant with our first son, Caleb. 2 years later, we had our daughter, Emma. Daniel worked his way up in his family's property management company, and I stayed home, then worked part-time, then started taking real estate courses at night once both kids were in school. Here is the part of the story I never told anyone outside of my own head for almost 2 decades. In my late 20s, I noticed something nobody else in the Whitfield family seemed to care about: undervalued properties, small strip malls in transitional neighborhoods, old motor courts along the coast that were one renovation away from being worth triple what the owners were asking. While the Whitfields spent their weekends golfing and comparing country club memberships, I spent mine driving around Pinellas and Collier counties with a legal pad, writing down addresses and estimated repair costs. In 2004, I used $11,000 of savings, money I'd made teaching a weekend real estate exam prep class, to put a down payment on my first property, a rundown 4-unit apartment building in a part of St. Petersburg that nobody wanted to touch. I didn't tell Daniel's family. I barely told Daniel the full extent of it because by then I already understood something about the Whitfields that took me years to fully accept. They didn't respect money that was earned quietly. They respected money that announced itself. So I let mine stay quiet. I formed a small LLC under my maiden name, Bennett Property Holdings, and every year I added something. A duplex here, a small retail strip there. I learned zoning law on my lunch breaks. I learned how to read a rent roll before I learned how to make a proper beef Wellington for Eleanor's Christmas dinners, which, incidentally, she never once complimented no matter how hard I tried. I still remember the first time I walked through that St. Petersburg building after closing, keys in hand, standing in a unit that smelled like old carpet and forgotten cigarettes, and feeling something I hadn't felt since I walked across the stage at my own college graduation, the specific, private satisfaction of having done something entirely on my own terms that no one had handed me and no one could take credit for. I called my mother from the parking lot that day. She was the only person who understood immediately what it meant, because she'd spent 30 years cleaning other people's houses and had told me, more than once, "Rachel, the day you own something instead of just tending to somebody else's, you tell me." "I want to hear it," I told her. She cried on the phone, and so did I, standing in a cracked parking lot in a part of town Eleanor Whitfield would never have set foot in willingly. By the time our kids were in middle school, Bennett Property Holdings owned 11 properties across the Tampa Bay and Southwest Florida markets, cash flowing quietly, reinvesting quietly, growing quietly. My accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, was the only person besides my attorney who understood the full scope of what I'd built. Daniel knew I dabbled in real estate. His family thought I did some part-time property management to keep myself busy, the way you'd let a bored housewife take up needlepoint. I let them think that. It cost me nothing, and it told me everything about how they actually saw me. I remember one property in particular, a boarded-up motor court just outside of Bradenton that I picked up in 2011 for less than the price of a modest sedan. Daniel's father, Walter Whitfield, drove past it once on his way to a golf outing and mentioned at dinner that somebody ought to tear that eyesore down. I sat across the table, cutting my chicken, and said nothing, because by then I already owned it, already had a contractor lined up, already knew it would be worth 4 times what I paid within 3 years. I let Walter believe the property was simply an eyesore nobody sensible would touch. 18 months later, it reopened as an 8-unit boutique bungalow rental that stayed booked nearly year-round. Walter never made the connection. I never offered it to him. There's a phrase I want you to remember, because it's going to matter later. People will tell you exactly how much they respect you by how much they think you're capable of. The Whitfields thought I was capable of folding napkins and staying quiet at dinner parties. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The disrespect didn't arrive all at once. If it had, I think I would have left years earlier. Instead, it came the way water erodes stone, so slowly you don't notice the shape of the thing changing until one day you look up and the whole landscape is different. It started with small comments at family dinners. "Rachel, be a dear and get the good china down. You know where everything is," Eleanor would say, even though I was a guest in her home just like everyone else. It moved on to my husband's sister, Courtney, introducing me to her friends as Daniel's wife instead of by my name, as though I were an accessory he'd picked out rather than a person with one of her own. At my son Caleb's high school graduation, Eleanor pulled me aside and told me, in front of my own mother, that it was sweet that I'd found my way into a family like ours. My mother didn't say anything. She just squeezed my hand hard enough that I understood she was holding back for my sake. I remember a specific dinner, the winter Caleb was 16, when Eleanor hosted a small gathering for some of Walter's old business associates. I'd spent 2 days preparing, coordinating the caterer for the parts I couldn't handle myself, arranging flowers, making sure the good silver was polished. Partway through the evening, one of Walter's associates, a silver-haired man named Robert, turned to me and asked, kindly enough, what I did for work. Before I could answer, Eleanor cut in smoothly. Rachel keeps herself busy, she said, patting my hand like I was a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. She's wonderful with the house. Robert nodded politely and moved on to ask Daniel about the family's property management portfolio. I remember excusing myself to the kitchen a few minutes later, standing at the sink with my hands in dishwater I didn't need to be washing, and thinking, calmly, almost scientifically, that's the 4th time this year she's done that. I'd started keeping count without meaning to. By the time Caleb left for college and Emma started her junior year of high school, the pattern had a name in my head, even if I never said it out loud. I was the built-in staff of the Whitfield family, not a daughter-in-law, not a partner, staff. At Thanksgiving, I was the one who just naturally ended up in the kitchen while Eleanor and Courtney sat with their wine in the living room, discussing renovations to Courtney's Naples condo. At the annual 4th of July gathering at the family's lake house, I was the one who Eleanor assumed would coordinate the caterer, confirm the fireworks permit, and make sure the important people had their preferred seating, as though I were the event planner rather than a member of the family being planned for. Daniel noticed some of it. To his credit, he'd occasionally say something to his mother, and she would wave him off with a laugh, telling him he was being dramatic, that this was simply how things worked in their family, that every family had roles, and mine happened to be the one that kept things running smoothly. Daniel, God love him, believed that smoothing things over was kinder than confronting them. For years, I let him believe that too, because I was building something else entirely, and I didn't need his mother's approval to keep doing it. There was one incident, around the time Emma turned 14, that I still consider a turning point in how I understood my place in that family. Eleanor was hosting a fundraiser for the local Historical Preservation Society at her home, an event with nearly 60 guests, caterers, a small string quartet, the works. 2 days before the event, her original event coordinator canceled, and rather than hire a replacement, Eleanor simply informed me, not asked, informed, that I'd be stepping in, because in her words, "You're so good at this sort of thing, and it saves us the fee." I spent 18 hours over 2 days managing vendors, seating charts, and a last-minute linen delivery, unpaid, uncredited, while simultaneously closing on my 9th property that same week, a transaction I handled entirely over emails sent from my phone between seating chart revisions. At the event itself, Eleanor stood at the podium and thanked, by name, the florist, the caterer, and the string quartet. She did not mention me once. Daniel found me afterward in the kitchen, stacking rental chairs, and said, gently, "You did an amazing job tonight." I remember looking at him and saying, "Did you notice she never said my name?" He hadn't. That, more than anything Eleanor ever said to my face, was the moment I understood exactly how invisible I'd become, even to the person who was supposed to see me most clearly. There's a moment I think about often from around that time. I was in my home office, a converted spare bedroom with a filing cabinet Eleanor once described as very utilitarian, very you, closing on my 14th property. It was a 12-unit building in Sarasota that I picked up for a fraction of its post-renovation value. I remember signing the closing documents at my kitchen table at 11 at night, my reading glasses pushed up on my head, while down the hall Daniel watched golf highlights and texted his mother about weekend plans I hadn't even been asked about yet. I want to say something to you if you've ever felt like the quiet one in the room, the one whose work goes unnoticed while somebody else gets the credit for holding the family together. Being underestimated is uncomfortable, but it is also, sometimes, the safest place to build something enormous. Nobody watches the person they've already decided doesn't matter. If any of this feels familiar, if you've ever swallowed a comment at a dinner table because saying something wasn't worth the fight yet, I hope you'll stick around and consider joining this community. We tell these stories because so many of you have lived a version of them, and there's something powerful about not being alone in it. The event that finally broke the dam happened almost by accident, the way most disasters do. In 2019, the Whitfield family's favorite vacation spot, a historic 72-room property on the Gulf Coast called the Windermere Cove Resort, went up for sale. The Whitfields had been vacationing there since Daniel's grandfather's time, 3 generations of golf outings, anniversary dinners, and 4th of July fireworks on that same stretch of private beach. Eleanor treated Windermere Cove like a second ancestral home, name-dropping it at every dinner party, as though owning a standing reservation there made her landed gentry. The resort's previous owners, an aging couple looking to retire, had let the property slide into deferred maintenance, outdated wiring, a roof that needed replacing, a restaurant that hadn't turned a profit in 3 years. To most buyers looking only at the surface, it looked like a losing bet. I saw something different. I saw 40 prime acres of Gulf front real estate, a historic property eligible for state preservation tax credits, and an ownership group tired enough to sell below market value to the right buyer with cash in hand and patience. I spent 4 months quietly working with Priya and my attorney, a methodical, unflappable man named Gregory Osei, structuring the purchase through a newly formed holding company, Cove Preservation Partners, LLC. I didn't do it to spite the Whitfields. I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't yet know how the story was going to end. I did it because it was, on every metric I'd learned to trust over 20 years, an excellent investment. The fact that it happened to be the resort my husband's family treated like a birthright was, at the time, simply a strange and slightly amusing coincidence. The months leading up to closing were tense in ways that had nothing to do with real estate. Eleanor had begun, with increasing frequency, treating me less like an overlooked in-law and more like an employee she'd forgotten she'd hired. She started a family group text to coordinate the annual Windermere Cove trip a full year in advance, and within that group text, my role was made explicit in ways it never had been before. Rachel, can you call the resort and confirm the block of rooms? Rachel, find out if they allow outside catering for the anniversary dinner. Rachel, someone needs to handle the deposit. You're so organized about that sort of thing. I answered every single message. I made every single call. What none of them knew was that by the 3rd message, I was calling my own front desk. There was a night that spring I still think about. Daniel and I were getting ready for bed, and he mentioned, almost as an aside, that his mother had told a family friend at the club that I handled the logistics for their family the way some women just naturally do. He laughed a little when he said it, not unkindly, more out of habit than anything else. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, unclipping my earrings, and asking him, quietly, "Daniel, do you know what I actually do all day?" He said, "Of course I do. Real estate stuff." I asked him to name one property. He couldn't. 20 years of marriage, and my own husband couldn't name a single address in a portfolio that, by then, was quietly worth more than his entire family's citrus and property fortune combined. I didn't tell him that number. I just turned off the light. The sale closed quietly in March of 2020, just as the world was starting to shut down. Renovations were delayed by the pandemic, which turned out to be a strange gift. It gave me 2 extra years to work behind the scenes without anyone noticing the resort had changed hands at all, since it briefly closed to the public and reopened under the same name, the same staff, the same general manager, just with a very different owner listed on paperwork nobody in the Whitfield family had any reason to go looking for. By the summer of this year, Windmere Cove was fully renovated, fully booked, and more beloved by the Whitfield family than ever. Eleanor had already put down the deposit for the annual family reunion weekend. 4 generations, 23 family members, the works. In the weeks leading up to the trip, the group text grew more demanding, not less. Eleanor added a new thread specifically for trip logistics and made me the de facto administrator of it without asking. When I suggested, gently, that maybe the resort's own concierge team could handle room assignments this year, Eleanor replied within minutes, "Rachel, you know I don't trust strangers with these details. You've always been so much better at this than any concierge could be." I remember reading that message at my kitchen table, next to a stack of closing documents for a 14-unit complex in Fort Myers, and laughing, not a happy laugh, the kind that comes out when something is too absurd to be angry about yet. I was, at that exact moment, a woman more qualified to run a hospitality company than the actual hospitality company I owned, being told by my mother-in-law that I was simply good at these things, as though competence were a personality quirk rather than 2 decades of deliberate, disciplined work. I remember the exact moment I decided not to tell Daniel beforehand. It was 2 weeks before the trip, and Eleanor called our house to go over the logistics, which meant she wanted me to confirm dietary restrictions, coordinate a welcome basket for each room, and make sure someone competent checked in with the concierge ahead of time. She said all of this to me, on the phone, without once asking how I was doing, what I had going on that week, or whether I even wanted to attend. I hung up the phone, looked at the framed photo on my desk of the Windmere Cove closing, me and Gregory shaking hands in front of the property with the sale sign still up, and I thought, quietly, calmly, let's just go to the resort. I'll tell them when the moment is right. I had no plan for humiliation, I promise you that. I simply intended to let the week unfold and decide, based on how they treated me, whether the truth needed to come out at all. As it turned out, the Whitfield family made that decision for me. The reunion weekend started well enough, or as well as it ever did. We arrived on a Thursday, 23 Whitfields checking into a resort I owned outright, though only Priya, Gregory, and I knew that. The staff, trained not to reveal ownership information to guests, treated me exactly like every other Whitfield, politely, professionally, invisibly. Thursday night passed uneventfully enough. There was a welcome dinner in the resort's main dining room where Eleanor made a toast about family, tradition, and the places that hold our memories, gesturing broadly at the restored dining hall, a room I had personally approved the renovation plans for, down to the crown molding. I sat through the toast with a glass of wine I barely touched, watching my mother-in-law thank a resort staff for their hospitality without once knowing she was thanking, in essence, herself. The trouble began Friday morning. Eleanor had organized a welcome brunch on the veranda overlooking the pool, and as guests began arriving with their luggage from a shuttle mix-up at the front desk, 4 suitcases ended up temporarily stacked near our table. They belonged to my sister-in-law Courtney's in-laws, the Hendersons, an image-conscious couple from Charleston that Eleanor had been trying to impress for 2 years, ever since Courtney's daughter got engaged to their son. Eleanor spotted the bags, spotted me standing nearby with a mimosa I hadn't even had a chance to sip, and without missing a beat, called across the veranda, "Get the help to move these bags before the Hendersons see them sitting on the veranda like that." I froze. Not because I was hurt, though I was, but because I genuinely could not believe, after 22 years, that she had said it out loud, in full sentences, in front of my own children. My daughter Emma, 20 years old and home from college for the summer, went white. My son Caleb, 23, actually laughed, the short, disbelieving laugh of someone who can't process what they just heard. Daniel, to his credit, said, "Mom," in a warning tone, but Eleanor waved him off exactly the way she always had. "I meant no offense," Eleanor said, already turning back to the Hendersons. "Rachel's wonderful at this sort of thing. She practically runs these trips." There it was, the sentence that had defined 2 decades of my marriage, delivered as a compliment. Rachel's wonderful at this sort of thing. Not Rachel built a real estate portfolio worth 8 figures. Not Rachel closed a deal on this exact property 4 years ago. Rachel's wonderful at moving luggage. I said nothing. I want to be honest. For one long moment, standing there in front of my children with a mimosa sweating in my hand, I considered simply walking away from all of it. Not the confrontation, the marriage, the family, 22 years of small erosions finally collapsing into one clean break. But I've learned something in 20 years of quiet business dealings. You don't walk away from a negotiation in anger. You walk away with leverage. I set my glass down, smiled at Eleanor the way I'd smiled at difficult sellers 100 times before, and said, "Of course, I'll take care of it." Then I picked up my phone, walked to a quiet corner of the veranda, and called Gregory O.C. "I think it's time," I told him. He opened the leather folio and withdrew a single document, the recorded deed to the Windmere Cove Resort, showing Cove Preservation Partners, LLC, as owner of record, and beneath that, in a separate document he laid gently on the linen-covered table between us, the operating agreement listing Rachel Bennett Whitfield as sole managing member. "For the past 4 years," Gregory said, in the calm, unhurried tone of a man who has delivered exactly this kind of news before, "Windmere Cove Resort has been owned by my client. The staff you've been working with all weekend, the reservations department Eleanor coordinated the reunion through, the entire property, it belongs to Rachel." He didn't stop there. He laid a second document on the table, the closing statement from 2020, showing the purchase price and the buyer of record. Then a third. the State Historic Preservation Tax Credit certification, with my name listed as the qualifying applicant, the same certification that had funded nearly a third of the renovation everyone at that reunion had spent the week admiring. Walter, who had been quiet until that point, leaned forward and studied the closing statement like a man checking a stock ticker he didn't trust. "This says Cove Preservation Partners," he said. "Rachel, are you telling me you bought this place outright? In cash?" "Structured financing mostly," I said. "But yes, outright." I watched the information land on each face in a different order, like dominoes falling at slightly different speeds. Eleanor's cousin Barbara, who'd flown in from Ohio and had no real stake in any of it, simply said, out loud, to no one in particular, "Well, I'll be damned," which, in that moment, felt like the most honest sentence anyone at Windmere Cove had spoken all weekend. I have never, in 22 years of marriage, seen my mother-in-law's face do what it did in that moment. It wasn't shock exactly. It was closer to a kind of internal recalculation, a woman trying to run the same math 3 different ways and getting the same impossible answer each time. "That's not," Eleanor started, then stopped. She looked at Daniel. "Did you know about this?" "No," Daniel said quietly, and I watched something shift in his face too, not anger at me, but a slow, dawning understanding of exactly how long he'd stood by while his family treated the architect of his family's favorite vacation spot like household staff. Courtney, to her credit, actually laughed. A short, stunned bark of disbelief followed immediately by, wait. You own Windmere Cove? You own the resort?" "I do," I said. "I have for 4 years. I want to tell you the quote that came out of my mouth next, because I didn't plan it, and it's the kind of sentence I think about often now. Eleanor, recovering some of her composure, said, "Well, Rachel, if you'd simply told us, none of this would have needed to happen this way." And I said, "Eleanor, I've been telling you who I am for 22 years. You just never thought I was worth listening to." The moment those words left my mouth, I understood something important, and I want to say it plainly for anyone who needs to hear it. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need to raise its voice to be undeniable. The quietest sentence in the room can still be the one that changes everything. The rest of that afternoon unfolded the way I imagine most reckonings do, not in one dramatic explosion, but in a series of smaller, cascading realizations. The Hendersons, visibly uncomfortable at having witnessed the whole thing, made polite excuses and retreated to their room, which I later learned they never actually paid for, because I quietly comped their entire stay through the front desk. A decision I made not for Eleanor's sake, but because I didn't want 2 innocent strangers dragged further into a family reckoning that had nothing to do with them. Courtney, once the initial shock wore off, actually sought me out that evening on the beach, where I'd gone to be alone. "I owe you an apology," she said, sitting down in the sand a respectful distance away. "I've spent 15 years going along with the way Mom talks about you because it was easier than pushing back. That's on me, not just her. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo 15 years, but it was real, and I told her I appreciated her saying it, because holding on to every grievance forever isn't justice. It's just a different kind of prison. My children were, without question, the part of that weekend that meant the most to me. Emma found me on the beach not long after Courtney left and simply put her head on my shoulder and said, "Mom, I've been embarrassed by Grandma Eleanor my whole life, and I didn't even know the half of what you were dealing with." Caleb, later that night, raised a toast at family dinner, a dinner Eleanor did not attend, that I still think about. He said, "To my mother, who built an empire while everyone at this table thought she was just really good at folding napkins." 20 family members laughed. A few of them, I noticed, laughed a little uncomfortably, the laugh of people realizing they'd been part of the joke that wasn't actually funny. Walter came to find me the next morning, alone, before the rest of the family was awake. He'd never been unkind to me the way Eleanor had, but he'd never once defended me either, which I'd come to understand was its own quiet form of participation. He stood at the edge of the veranda, coffee in hand, and said, "I drove past a motor court outside Bradenton years ago, called it an eyesore." I told him I remembered. "That was you too, wasn't it?" It wasn't really a question. I nodded. He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the water. I've spent 30 years assuming the smartest person in this family was whichever one of us was loudest about it," he finally said. "I'm sorry, Rachel. That's a hell of a thing to get wrong for 30 years. It wasn't a grand apology, but from Walter Whitfield, a man who rarely apologized for anything, it was seismic. Even the resort's own longtime general manager, a woman named Denise, who had run the property since before my ownership and had spent the entire weekend treating me with the same polite, practiced neutrality she extended to every Whitfield, pulled me aside that evening. "I've worked for you for 4 years and never once said your name out loud in front of this family," she said, half laughing, half apologetic. "I think I owe you a proper introduction to your own in-laws." I told her she owed me nothing at all. She'd simply been protecting my privacy exactly the way I'd asked her to, 4 years earlier, when I told her I wasn't ready for the Whitfields to know. By Sunday morning, the news had traveled through every branch of the extended family, the way news always does at these gatherings, whispered over coffee, and passed along in hallway conversations. Aunts and cousins who had spent years treating me as a pleasant but forgettable addition to the family suddenly found reasons to strike up conversations with me by the pool, asking careful, curious questions about how it all started, as though my 20 years of quiet work were a party trick they'd only just been let in on. I answered politely, without bitterness, because I understood something by then that I hadn't fully understood on Friday morning. Their surprise wasn't really about the resort. It was about realizing how little they'd actually known about the person who'd been setting their table for 2 decades. Eleanor herself didn't speak to me again until Sunday afternoon, just before we packed the cars to leave. She found me on the porch of my own resort, arms crossed, looking somehow smaller than she had at any point in the 22 years I'd known her. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words visibly unfamiliar in her mouth, like a language she'd never bothered to learn. "I don't know that I can explain why I said what I said Friday morning, other than that I've apparently spent a very long time not seeing you at all." I told her I appreciated her saying so, and that I hoped, in time, she meant it. She nodded, and for the first time in over 2 decades, she didn't have a quick, deflecting reply ready. She just stood there, quiet, in the silence she'd spent so many years making other people sit in. Daniel and I talked late into that first night, out on the private balcony of the room I now technically owned, in the resort I now technically owned, in a marriage I was, for the first time in years, unsure I still wanted to own a piece of. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and it wasn't an accusation. It was closer to grief. Because for 20 years, I told him, telling the truth about what I'd built never felt safe in this family. Your mother makes it very clear, in 100 small ways, whose accomplishments are allowed to matter. I stopped waiting for permission to matter a long time ago, Daniel. I just never stopped hoping you'd notice on your own. He sat with that for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not respond at all. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting 22 years for someone in that family to ask me. How big is it, Rachel? Actually, tell me the real number. I told him. I watched his face do the same slow recalculation I'd watched on his mother's face that afternoon. Except on Daniel, it didn't land as shock. It landed as shame. I've spent our whole marriage thinking I was the one carrying us, he said quietly, providing the stability, the name, the family. And the entire time, you were building something I couldn't have built in 100 years, and I never once asked you a real question about it because I assumed I already knew the answer. I told him that was, in a single sentence, the entire problem. Not that he'd failed to ask, but that he'd assumed he didn't need to. What happens now? He asked. That depends on whether you can spend the next 20 years the way you spent this conversation, I said. Actually asking, actually looking. He didn't have a good answer for that beyond a promise, and I respected him more for not pretending a promise was the same thing as proof. I told him proof would take time, and that I was, for the first time in a long time, willing to give it. Here's what I want you to understand about what happened over the following months, because the resolution to a story like this is rarely as clean as the confrontation itself. Eleanor did not have some instant, movie-perfect transformation. Old patterns don't dissolve in an afternoon. But something did change. 2 weeks after we returned home, she called me, not Daniel, me, and asked, stiffly, awkwardly, if I would be willing to have lunch with her. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity. Over lunch, she told me something I never expected to hear from Eleanor Whitfield, that her own mother had built a small dressmaking business in the 1960s that her father had never once acknowledged in public, that she'd grown up watching her mother's work be treated as a hobby, while her father took credit for the family's rising fortunes at dinner parties, and that somewhere along the way, she'd absorbed the idea that a woman's accomplishments were only valuable if a man validated them first. I think I did to you, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. What I watched happen to my mother, and I told myself it was normal because it was familiar. That doesn't excuse it. I know that. I don't think Eleanor and I will ever be close in the way some mothers and daughters-in-law are. But she has, in the year since, made a genuine effort, introducing me by name, asking about Bennett property holdings at dinners instead of steering conversation away from me, even, once, awkwardly, asking my advice on a small investment property she was considering. Old habits leave slowly, but they do leave sometimes if a person is finally willing to look at them honestly. There was a second lunch, a few months after the first, where Eleanor brought up the Windmere Cove weekend directly for the only time since it happened. I've thought a great deal about what I said that morning, she told me, turning her water glass slowly on the table without drinking from it. Get the help. I've replayed it more times than I'd like to admit. The worst part isn't even that I said it in front of everyone. The worst part is that I meant it. Some part of me had genuinely decided, years ago, that you were exactly that. Help. Useful. Managed. Not equal. She looked up at me then, and for the first time in 22 years, I saw something in Eleanor Whitfield's face that looked almost like fear, the fear of a woman confronting the version of herself she'd never planned on meeting. "I don't know how to undo 22 years of thinking that way," she said. "I only know I don't want to spend the next 22 thinking it too." I told her that was, as far as I was concerned, the only apology that ever really counts. Not the one that asks to be forgiven, but the one that commits to being different. Courtney and I have grown closer in the time since, in ways I didn't expect. She's asked me, twice now, for advice on a small rental property she's considering buying with her husband, and both times I've watched her listen to me the way you listen to someone whose opinion you've actually decided matters, not the way you nod politely at a mother-in-law's dinner guest. It's a small thing. I've learned over the last year that most repair is made of small things, strung together patiently over time. Daniel and I are still married, still working on 22 years of accumulated silence, one honest conversation at a time. He's changed the most out of anyone. He now talks about Bennett property holdings the way he used to talk about his own family's citrus fortune, with genuine pride, unprompted, to people who never asked. It's a small thing. It matters enormously. I still own Windmere Cove Resort. The Whitfield family still vacations there every summer, though now, when the staff greets me, they call me by my correct title, and Eleanor, for the first time in 22 years, does not correct them. I think often about the version of me who put $11,000 down on a rundown building in St. Petersburg without telling a soul, and I wonder if she knew, even a little, that she was building more than a portfolio. I think she was building an exit that she hoped she'd never need, and a proof of worth that she hoped, somewhere deep down, she'd eventually get to show. Both of those things turned out to be true, just not in the order I expected. People sometimes ask me if I regret the years of silence, whether I wish I'd confronted Eleanor the very first time she introduced me as Daniel's wife instead of by my name, or the first time she asked me to fetch the good china in a house that wasn't mine. I've thought about that question for a long time, and my honest answer is no. Not because the silence didn't cost me something. It did, more than I let myself feel most days, but because that same silence gave me 20 years of uninterrupted focus to build something no one could take from me or talk me out of. There's a difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from strategy. For a long time, I couldn't tell which one I was living in. Looking back now, I think it was both, tangled together, and I don't know that I could have separated them even if I'd tried. If you're in the middle of your own version of that silence right now, if you're the one who handles the logistics, who gets introduced by someone else's name, who watches your own accomplishments get folded quietly into somebody else's credit, I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to keep building, even if no one is watching. Especially if no one is watching. The people who underestimate you today are not entitled to a preview of what you're becoming. They are only entitled to the truth when you decide it's time for them to have it, and not one moment sooner. And when that moment does come, and it will, if you keep building, you do not need to raise your voice to make it land. You do not need to perform your worth the way you might once have performed your patience. You simply need to set the proof on the table, calmly, and let the people who spent years underestimating you sit with the silence of finally understanding. If this story meant something to you, stay a while longer. This channel is full of stories about women who spent years being overlooked and finally, quietly, took back what was always theirs. Subscribe if you want more of them. There are so many more women out there just like us, and I think their stories deserve to be heard too.